Welcome back. We are now in session number 9, and we're going to be working on chapter 8. And this is again one of those chapters where we kind of step back from looking at diagramming and looking at different specific details of describing what it is that we're doing with language in English. And we look at some more prescriptive angles of things and try to figure out what's going on, what kinds of things people have difficulty with in relation to different things that we're talking about. And so this chapter is actually about usage, and so it's about case, agreement, and consistency. So we're going to look at different kinds of agreement in this chapter. And it's a little bit of a break from our intense diagramming routine that we've been doing in the last couple of chapters. So I hope it'll be pleasant for you to take a break from that. All right, if we look at subject and verb agreement, this is something you're all familiar with because you use it all the time when you're speaking English. We know that in English, plural nouns usually end in S. Now we have some irregular nouns, as we talked about before, that have irregular plurals, things like mouse going to mice and that kind of thing. But most of our plurals take an S ending in order to indicate that it's a plural noun. But we also have the exact same morpheme that we use for third person singular. All right, so the same one on verbs, right? This is when we're talking about verbs. All right, so for example, if I say the ducks walk, then I've got a plural S on duck, so the ducks walk, and then I have, if I have just one, the duck, it's going to be walks. All right, the duck walks. And so you notice that if we have an S here, we don't have it here. If we don't have an S here, we have the S here in present tense, of course. We're going to talk more about tense in our next session. All right, so so far, this shouldn't be too surprising or confusing for you. But we run into some difficulty when we have compound structures. So, for example, if something is joined together with and, then it's always going to be plural. So if we say books and materials are on the table, right? We get a plural form of the verb with books and materials, right? And there's only one exception to this, and that is when we have something that is conceived of as one unit. We have a lot of food items like this, and this would be like macaroni and cheese, right? Macaroni and cheese is on the table, not are on the table, unless we're conceiving of them as separate things. So with and, it's pretty straightforward, usually plural, unless we have sort of a special structure where things pattern together all the time. But with or nor, we bump into a bit of a problem. Usually because the or is introducing this kind of contrast, it's either one or the other, and so it's not a given that you're going to have plural like with the and. But if both things with both parts of the compound subject or object with or nor are plural, then you're definitely going to get plural. But if one is plural and one is singular, then it gets a little tricky. So let's look at an example. So either the words or the music is familiar. Right? So in this case, Either the words or the music is familiar. Words is plural. Music is singular. So what are we going to do here? Are we going to have a plural verb or a singular verb? And the answer in this case, just when we have or nor, is that we choose the form of the verb that matches the noun that is closest to the verb. So in this case, music is singular, so we get a singular verb. But if I had the music or the words, so the music or the words, then I'm going to get are familiar, because the plural is closer to are. So when we have this kind of mixed situation, then we're going to get that kind of an agreement. That's just a little tricky sometimes when you bump into that. Okay, the next item to talk about in terms of agreement here are when we have a subject plus a prepositional phrase that occurs before the verb, all right? So we have a subject with a prepositional phrase before the verb, and sometimes the prepositional phrase can have an object that's plural. So something like the music along with the words is familiar. But in that case, when we have a prepositional phrase after the subject, only the subject agrees with the verb, and it doesn't matter what word is the object of the preposition here. If it's a prepositional phrase, we ignore it in terms of the structure of the sentence. So you're just going to have subject and verb agreement. So if you said George with his classmates went to school, then you would have a singular form, or walks to school every day. All right. Then we have another special case, and this is when we have words that specify a number or amount, like enough, or many, none, some, much, and a few other ones like this. So if it's indicating a number or amount, then the noun that comes after it, if it is countable, and plural, then you're going to get a plural verb, form of the verb, right? If it is non-count, we talked about this distinction when we were talking about nouns at the beginning of the class, then we're just going to get a singular verb. All right, so for example, some of the cookies is countable, are left. So some of the cookies, plural, are left. But some of the coffee, non-count noun, is left. All right, so when it's non-count, we're going to get that singular, because we're not thinking of it in a plural kind of way. All right, the next item we have, and we go through a number of these before we get to an exercise, so hang in there. If you're, you can stop the tape if you need to and take a breather if it gets to be a lot of material. The next one is when we have a special case with relative clauses. So let's say we have a sentence like, Jim is one of those people who are unaccountably moody. All right, Jim is one of those people who are unaccountably moody. And it's when we have this kind of structure, one of those included, that we get a little bit of a problem. It's followed by this relative clause, rather. And it's tempting to say Jim is one of those people who is unaccountably moody here, is referring back to Jim, but when we have relative clauses, they modify the noun that is right before them. And in this case, that noun is people. And since people is plural, who is also plural. And so we should have a plural form of the verb there. So Jim is one of those people who are unaccountably moody. So again, this relative clause modifying people. And now there's one exception to this, and this is what makes life complicated. If we add the words the only, Jim is the only one of those people who, then we're going to get is unaccountably moody, because the only makes it clear that we're referring to Jim. And so only in that case are we going to get this kind of a situation. All right. Another special case is when we have collective nouns. All right, collective nouns are nouns like audience, jury, team, company, committee, class, group. So when we're talking about a group, then we're thinking of that group as a unit. And they usually take singular verbs in most cases. So we'd say the jury is deadlocked, for example. All right, so here we're going to have a singular form because we're thinking of the jury as a whole. Now, it is possible, if you are thinking of this collective noun in terms of individuals doing separate things, that you could have an are in this case, but it needs to be very clear from context that that's what you have. And an example would be, example that they give you in the book is, in small groups scattered through the theater, the cast were rehearsing several scenes to prepare for the performance that evening. And so we've made it clear from the context of this sentence that we're thinking of the cast in terms of individual groups of people. My recommendation is don't bother trying to remember this rule. Just do singular with collective nouns, and if you want to emphasize that they're doing individual things, then just use a different noun or revise the sentence in some other way to avoid having to deal with that issue. All right. The last thing to mention is when we have there, the word there as an expletive. So a sentence like, there was a face in the mirror. Okay, there was a face in the mirror. We have there was or there were sentences all the time in English. And this there is something that is sometimes called a dummy subject, because it's acting kind of grammatically like a subject, but in terms of the content of the sentence, it really is not a subject. It's just sort of a filler word. And so that's why we're calling it an expletive. So if we're going to diagram something like this, we would have the subject be a face. And we can tell that this is kind of functioning really as the real subject because the verb has to agree with it, right? We have singular face, we have singular was here. And so we have a face was in the mirror is the basic sentence. And then to show that we have this there here, we're going to put it up on a shelf like we do with other expletives. And that's what that sentence would look like. There was a face in the mirror. All right. Now would be a good time for you to take a break, pause the tape, and do exercise 8.1. There are a lot of examples there for you to practice these items that we've just talked about. So come back in a minute. All right, our next kind of agreement that we need to pay attention to is pronoun agreement. Pronoun agreement. All right, so if you have a noun that is being replaced with a pronoun later, that pronoun needs to go together with the noun, needs to match the noun. So if we have a sentence like, Marla enjoyed her experience at the game. Perfectly acceptable English sentence. Marla is singular and feminine, so we have her experience at the game, and it's perfectly fine. But a problem comes in terms of pronoun agreement when we have a sentence like, everyone enjoyed their experience. Okay, but we'll just stop with experience. Everyone enjoyed their experience, and here we have plural form of the pronoun, and everyone, even though logically it is plural, is still singular. Remember these indefinite pronouns that we looked at before: everyone, someone, no one, and anyone. Even though everyone seems logically like it's plural, and so this should agree with it, it actually is singular, and so that is a problem. Now, the real dilemma that we have here is that for the last 30 or 40 years or so, we have come to the conclusion that using he as a generic pronoun is sexist, and that was a good decision as far as I'm concerned, but it does leave us with a dilemma. What do we do when we have situations where we need a generic pronoun, but the only generic pronouns that we have are plural, and that don't indicate sex? And so this is a problem. Now, actually, some dictionaries and other language authorities are beginning to accept this kind of a structure as acceptable just because there isn't really a decent alternative. And it's used so often in actual real speech by native speakers. So we may be seeing a transition to this eventually. It's not quite there yet, but we're getting there. All right, you need to be careful about generic pronouns, and these are going to be problematic for just about anyone. We can no longer use he as a generic pronoun. This would be an example of this would be if a student wants to succeed, he should do his homework. But we don't consider that grammatical any longer because you're using he exclusively, and so you're leaving out 50% of the population. Now, what some people have done is that they have decided that since we used he as a generic pronoun for so long, they are just going to use she as a generic pronoun to sort of make up for lost time. And that is a possible option. I see people do it from time to time. If a student wants to succeed, she should study hard. But I don't recommend that as an option just because it's a marked option, so it jars your reader a little bit. Not that they're upset about it, it just sort of takes their attention away from the content that you're trying to communicate. Now, eventually it may become so common that nobody notices it, but for the time being, I don't think it's recommended. And so that leaves us with things like he or she. Now, the first option and the best option in most cases is just to revise the sentence altogether and make it plural so that you can use their or they and get away with it that way, or get around the problem that way. But if you can't avoid using a singular subject, then you need to use he or she or his or her. And some different style sheets, like MLA, APA, Turabian style, have different ways of dealing with this. I personally really do not like the option where you do something like that to kind of indicate both she or he. I think that that's kind of clumsy. I think people have gotten so accustomed to he or she that they don't even notice it anymore, and it's not a problem to include it, but you have to make your own decisions there. Now, one other option is to use one, but using one can get really cumbersome very quickly. So once you begin using one must stick with if one uses one must stick with one throughout, and it gets just clumsy and awkward very quickly. All right. So, be careful with indefinite pronouns like everyone, but also be careful with collective nouns. So, the team celebrated its victory, not their victory. All right. Now I would recommend that you stop the tape and do exercise 8.2 to get some practice with some of these. Welcome back. Now we're looking at pronoun case. Now you remember, I'm sure you remember because you remember everything, right? You remember at the beginning of the course we talked about case in Old English. And we talked about the fact that in Old English we had 5 cases. So every noun had all these endings to indicate what role the noun was playing in the sentence. Well, in most cases, we have lost case in English, but there is one specific case where we've held on to it, and that is with our pronouns. And so we need to be careful with pronouns and case. For example, we have the nominative case pronouns, the subject case, which would be things like I, we, you, he, she, or it, or they. Those are things that can act like subjects. But then we have the object cases, and so that would be like me, or us, or you, or her, him, it, and them. And so those are cases where we have the object. So if we have a sentence like Jim and I wanted Marty and her, to join us. In this case, Jim and I is the subject of the sentence, so we're going to get the subject case of the pronoun I. But when we say wanted Marty and her, now we've got the object case of the pronoun because it's the object of the sentence. Now, a lot of people, because they are kind of like had to overcorrect to learn to use, like Jim and I at the beginning of sentence, they will say, Jim and I wanted Marty and I, or she, to join us, and that is incorrect because if it's acting like an object, we need it to be an object. And this is true when we have the objects of prepositions as well. So if I have at the beginning of the sentence between you and, it's going to be me, not I, between you and me, because between is a preposition and me is the object of the preposition. All right. Next item. I know we're moving through these quickly, but I think once you hear them, you recognize what you need to do with them. All right. When we have who or whom in a dependent clause, and this is something that you're going to bump into when you have noun clauses. So let's say we have a sentence like, we received sympathy from whoever listened to us. All right, so we received sympathy from whoever listened to us. Now, we just got done saying that when you have a preposition with an object, the object is going to be in object case. The pronoun object is going to be in object case. And so you would expect here, we received sympathy from whomever listened to us. But that is not what we get in this sentence. And here is why. In this case, whoever listened to us, this whole thing is a noun clause, right? And it's acting together as the object of the preposition. So it's not just whoever that is the object of the preposition, it's this whole clause that is the object of the preposition. And when that's the case, then and whoever is acting like the subject of the noun clause, then it's going to be in subject case because it's acting like the subject. All right, so we're going to get whoever there. But if I had a sentence like, we received sympathy from whomever we saw, in this case, we have whomever here, not because of from, but because whomever is the object of this clause here. We saw whomever. And so because it's acting like the object here, we already have a subject here and a verb. It's acting like the object here. In this case, you're going to get the object form. So it depends on what role does the pronoun have in the clause that it's a part of. And if it is the subject, then it's going to be in subject case. If it's the object, it's going to be an object case. All right, so that's just something to keep in mind. It's a little tricky sometimes. It throws you off because you're expecting, because of that preposition, that it's going to need to be object case, but in fact it doesn't need to be object case. All right, our next item is than, as comparisons. Okay, so when we use than and as in comparisons. So let's say we have the sentence, Sam is taller than what is the correct response here? Sam is taller than she, or Sam is taller than her? For most native speakers, your inclination is to say Sam is taller than her. But in actual fact, the complete form of this sentence would be Sam is taller than she is. And because of that, we need the subject case here. So Sam is taller than she. All right, or I wish I could be as relaxed as they are, right? I wish I could be as relaxed as they. Now, when we have sometimes there can be ambiguity in these sentences. When we have a sentence like, Bob likes, her better than I or me. In this case, if we say, Bob likes her better than me, then it means the comparison is between her and me. So that's a perfectly acceptable sentence because, he likes her or he likes me. But if we are thinking of this sentence as Bob likes her better than I do, then it needs to be I. All right, so it just depends on what the meaning is, whether we use I or me. So you have to be careful with these than or as comparisons. All right, now would be the time to stop the tape and do exercise 8.3 to get some practice using some of these items that we've just covered. Welcome back. Now we are ready to talk about reflexive and reciprocal pronouns. And the key thing here to remember is that when you have a reflexive, there needs to be an antecedent in the same sentence before you get to it. So, for example, if you say, I went by myself to the museum, then we have myself here, but before the myself, we've got I mentioned. And so this works because we've got an I before we get to myself. But if I said something like Carol and myself went to the museum, then I've got a problem, right? Because I don't have an antecedent here. I don't have I mentioned before I get to myself, so that does not work. Now, do remember that there are certain words that we do not have in the English language, even though you hear them quite a bit. We do not have his self, right? We don't have our self, so no singular form with our. We don't have them self, so no singular form with them. And we don't have their selves, so not the possessive form with selves. So all of these are not found in the English language. So try to avoid those. Okay, we are getting close to the end here. Just a few more things to go. The next thing to talk about are reciprocal pronouns. And I know you probably don't remember our conversation about reciprocal programs at the beginning of the course, but let's remind ourselves what we have as reciprocal pronouns. And we have each other and one another. And there's a very simple rule to follow with each other and one another. If you have less than two here, you're going to go with each other. So if you have two people you're talking about, it's each other. If you have greater than two, so three or more, then you're going to use one another. So a husband and wife should love each other, and in a family, everyone respects one another. All right. Okay, now you can stop the tape and do exercise 8.4. I think I asked you to do 8.4 already, maybe. Anyway, do 8.4 now. And then there is an exercise in 8.5 on pronoun consistency, and I think it's a good idea for you to go ahead and look at that. When it talks about pronoun consistency, what it's talking about is sticking to the same format of pronouns as you're writing a complete paragraph. So don't switch from third person to you to he to all these different kinds of ways you can reference people. Be consistent in the way that you refer to things throughout an entire paragraph. And you can see the example in 8.5 and kind of see an example of how it's done badly, and then think about how you might change that. All right, the final thing they mention in the chapter is broad reference witch. This is a witch that looks like this kind of a witch, not the kind that rides a broomstick, but is a witch that starts a relative clause that seems to refer back to the whole phrase rather than just the noun before it. And that's kind of a technical thing that's ungrammatical, but I'm not that worried. I'm not going to test you on that. So if you're interested in it, you can read about it in the book, and we aren't going to spend time on it here in class. All right, thank you so much for your time. We'll see you next time.